Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we've made some available on the small table by the entrance. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and as the Public Humanities Specialist, I lead the library's Public Humanities Initiative, which was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Eric Heinze, Professor of Law and Humanities at Queen Mary University of London, where he also directs the Center for Law, Democracy, and Society. His prior books include The Most Human Right, Why Free Speech is Everything, Hate Speech and Democratic Citizenship, The Concept of Injustice, The Logic of Constitutional Rights, sorry, lost my place, The Logic of Liberal Rights, The Logic of Equality, and Sexual Orientation, a Human Right. Heinze currently serves as general editor for major collections, including the Oxford Handbook of Hate Speech and The Criminalization of Hate Speech. He also serves on the advisory boards of the International Journal of Human Rights, University of Bologna Law Review, Heliopolis, Culture Civiltà Politica, I think that's right, not sure. Rivista Italiana di Filosofia Politica, Social Theory and Practice, Law, Human Environment, Rutledge Studies in Law, Rights, and Justice. Eric joins us tonight to present his recently published book, Coming Clean: The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. The publisher, MIT Press, describes it as a diagnosis of what has gone wrong with the left and what leftists must do if they want to change politics, ethics, and minds. Heinze's position is well described in an op-ed published with Times Higher Ed on April 15th of this year, referring to Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, namely that philosophers should not only interpret but also change the world. He writes, "What progressives still lack after more than a century is an 11th thesis drive to promote understandings of leftist atrocities not only in seminar rooms, but as part of broad public awareness programs and events. Without such engagement, it becomes a mystery what exactly leftist autocritique is supposed to be, or why progressives would have the rest of us undertake countless open and public exercises of collective self-examination, while they themselves do no such thing." Returning to the publisher, we may put a fine point on it. Leftists have rarely engaged in the kinds of open and public self-scrutiny that they demand from others, citing examples as different as the Ukraine war, LGBTQ+ people in Cuba, the concept of hatred, and the problem of left-wing anti-Semitism. Heinze explains why and how the left must change its memory politics if it is to claim any ethical high ground. Okay, that's the book. So, I'll also thank Labyrinth for supporting us tonight. They're here to do book sales, and I understand Eric's going to be joining us for signing afterwards. So I encourage you to check out the book and to chat with Eric afterwards over a signing. To discuss his new book, Eric is joined by Shamus Khan, who is Willard Thorpe Professor of Sociology and American Studies at Princeton University. He writes on culture, inequality, gender, and elites. He is the author of over 100 articles, books, and essays, including Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, The Practice of Research, Approaches to Ethnography, Modes of Representation and Analysis and Participant Observation, and Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus, which was named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR. Shamus seemed to me an excellent person for discussing this book with Eric, not only because of his expertise and its intersection with Eric's topic, but also because he joined us in March for a conversation with Musa Al-Gharbi about his book, We Have Never Been Woke, a program which you can now find on the library's YouTube channel and which I encourage you to view as a companion to tonight's conversation. Each of these programs bring into focus a topic which the library's Public Humanities Initiative is prioritizing this year, that is justice. Throughout 2025, the programming team at the library has been exploring justice from multiple perspectives and through the intersecting textures of our dense social fabric. This thematic programming was launched in January with a panel discussion on history and restorative justice in Princeton, bringing it home. Looking ahead, I'd like to highlight sociologist Corita L. Brown, her presentation of The Battle for the Black Mind on November 6th, that's next Thursday. She is joined in conversation by Lawrence Ralph. But now I'll hand it over to Eric, and he's going to begin with a short presentation from the podium. We'll have the conversation, proceed to Q&A, and then the signing. So Eric, Shamus, thank you both for being here.
Well, thank you very, very much, Cliff. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for all the effort and the hospitality. And of course, thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Don't let me get away with anything at the Q&A. I don't think I'll say a single thing this evening that I haven't doubted many times. So who knows, maybe one of you will push me right over the edge. Now, certainly since Trump's re-election, there's been massive examination on the left, among Democrats, progressives, what's gone wrong, what needs to change. I imagine that you have all heard and participated in these sorts of discussions many times, and that will not be stopping anytime soon. These discussions have often a fairly similar set of patterns. They may be about things like economic policy, about wealth redistribution, job creation, tax equity, identity politics, treatment of ethnic and racial minorities, of women, of LGBTQ people, and so forth. Abortion rights, right? These sorts of things. I don't think any of this would come as a surprise to any of you. And I have no immediate contribution to make to any of those particular policy points for the simple reason that everyone else is making them. I kind of want to step back in my own interrogation of what's gone wrong on the left, what's gone wrong among progressives. And so rather than looking at this policy or that policy, my question is really, I think, what has been the fundamental one ever since the concept of left kind of took on its contemporary meaning, which I would date to about 2 centuries back, give or take. I would say sometime after the Enlightenment, we start getting what can be called a recognizably contemporary sense of the progressive. And I think always lurking beneath those more particular policy points is this very fundamental concern with justice, or sometimes called social justice, although it could also be things like global justice. And so I want to ask at that level, at the fundamental level of pursuing justice, of challenging injustice, what's gone wrong? Because the ambition certainly seems correct. And I think that if there's been something distinctive about the ways in which the left or progressives, and certainly in our time, have understood the more general notion of justice, this umbrella concept which brings in all the more particular ones. And it's something, incidentally, quite extraordinary, quite unique, I think, in all of human history. A certain leftist understanding of justice, a rather recent one, which I think we find nowhere else. There are plenty of civilizations and cultures and traditions that are concerned with justice. But there's something quite distinctive about what we could call the contemporary leftist conception of justice, which I would summarize as follows. It's the idea that all of us collectively as a society need to understand our own history as one of oppression, as one of systemic, structural oppression. I think, again, throughout many societies in history, you'll find certainly an understanding, well, we have to find out, what mistakes have we made and how can we improve? That's nothing unusual. But I would argue that the idea that all of society, and again, not just elites, but everyone, needs to be brought into an understanding of one's own culture and history as fundamentally oppressive, as foundationally oppressive, as systemically oppressive, throughout a long past and a past which is still ongoing. This is quite distinctive. Now, if I were a conservative, because many conservatives have noticed this in whatever language they use, the conservative response is simply to trash it, to say that we just should not be doing that. We should not be teaching our children that. And indeed, to even draw policy conclusions, away with DEI, away with LGBTQ+, and all these other understandings of history as fundamentally oppressive. So that's so what we have among enormous numbers of conservatives is an unease with this leftist tradition, this leftist understanding of history, and then responding just by rejecting the whole thing and just wanting to get rid of it, really undo it. That's not my approach at all. I'm quite critical of it, but hopefully in a constructive way. Again, I'll have to let you be the judge of that. And so, what is the method of undertaking this kind of learning history as an exercise in collective self-scrutiny? An exercise in collective self-criticism and self-examination, which in my book I refer to as memory politics. And I argue that it takes place pretty much in two pretty easy steps. The first step is coming up with some sort of historical record, and even that can be quite controversial. But the second step, and this is crucial, is that history should not just take place in textbooks and seminar rooms. History should never just be an intellectual exercise. And this is where the Marx's famous 11th Feuerbach thesis comes in. The point is not simply to observe history, but to change it. Not simply to observe the world, but to change it. Yeah, and so so step one is, come up with some sort of historical record, which will be one about systemic oppression, structural oppression, ongoing oppression. But the crucial step is step two. It cannot stay in the textbooks and the seminar rooms. It needs to go into everyone's living room, so to speak, right? In other words, it needs to become also a source of activism, of radical and grassroots dissemination. So it's not something that simply intellectuals do and talk about, but that all of society engages in this exercise of collective self-scrutiny. I praise this. I think it is indeed a distinctive achievement of the left, and probably its greatest. If you were to ask me what is the greatest achievement on the left over the past century or two, I would not pin it to a particular policy or a particular politician or a particular government, although you could find some. I would call the greatest achievement this complete change in our mentality, so that it starts to seem kind of obvious, although no other culture does this. No other culture understands history as fundamentally an exercise in collective self-criticism and even self-censure, owing to its entire history. This is quite distinctive, and again, I praise it. The problem is this. This method of doing history as collective self-scrutiny is often referred to as telling the untold stories, right? It's often contrasted with what you could call traditionalist history, which, I don't know, starts with maybe Alexander the Great, and then, of course, throws in Plato and Aristotle, and, runs through to Julius Caesar, a bit of Charlemagne, then, Louis XIV, and then Thomas Jefferson, and right up to, the great men of history, the high deeds of the great men of history. That's what we would call a kind of a traditionalist history. And the left, you could call the leftist, or the progressive idea of history as self-scrutiny, wants to tell all the untold stories, right? What were the slaves doing? What were women doing? What were queer people doing? and so on. Again, I endorse all of this. The criticism in my book, and here's where we'll make our transition to our discussion. The criticism in my book is that leftists have been doing this telling the untold stories from upon a very high heap of their own untold stories. And that cannot continue. That cannot continue. It will. And that is why I think the left will just keep making the same mistake that it has made for decades, if not centuries. Because what has happened is that the left has continuously taught all the rest of us to do something that it never does itself. Now, you say this to a leftist, and they're going to be quite shocked and even outraged, because leftists do believe, and I understand why they believe this, they do believe that they do loads of self-scrutiny. You know, that they're quite hard on themselves, but the more you probe it, the more you see this almost never occurs. Remember when I was talking about those 2 steps of history? You get a fair amount of step 1. So you won't find many leftists today who will just deny the Stalinist gulags, who will just deny the Ukrainian famine, who will just deny the atrocities of Mao's Cultural Revolution and Pol Pot, and on and on and on. Very few will just deny it. What you never get is the step 2 that all the rest of us have to do. Right? Well, okay, if we need to be undertaking collective self-scrutiny of our own political commitments over time, where is then a culture of, yes, we have been implicated. Many of us did support Stalin. Many of us did support Mao. Why did we do it? You see, the way in which you critique Western liberal democracy is through what's often called discourse analysis, right? You look at terms like liberalism and equality and equal opportunity, and you show how they have been used to achieve just the opposite: inequality, oppression, lack of opportunity, right? A famous example is Plessy versus Ferguson, which did not create a regime of inequality, but rather justified it through the language of equality. Right? So this is critical theory at its best. This is leftist critique at its best. But where is now the leading critical theorist of our time, the leading leftists of our time, saying, oh yeah, well, this happened to all of our discourses too. And here's how. I'm going to assume that many, if not all of you, have had something to do with universities, as students, for example. And you'll be familiar with things like Women's History Month and Queer History Day and Black History and whatever. Raise your hand if the university you attended, and particularly, again, those who were doing these other critical histories, did something like a Socialist History Month. In other words, with the idea of, again, I don't mean conservatives doing it. I mean, we're going to do this, we're going to show you how we do self-critique. You get my point. This has to change. Otherwise, the left will always continue making the same mistakes it's made now for decades, if not centuries. I'll stop there, and then we'll continue with our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I want to start with the leftist tradition of self-criticism because it's actually essential to Maoist movements, to the Russian Socialist and Communist Party. And I want to ask why that doesn't count or what's different about it. So for those of you who aren't maybe so attuned to this, Lenin and subsequently Stalin both made very strong arguments that an essential feature of socialist communities and communist communities was the self-criticism of the members of that community and to actually engage in this. And I'd note that some of what you're calling for, some of what you're referencing, this idea, it seems to even capture up what were really interesting psychological approaches at the time of thinking about like, why am I failing as a communist? Why am I failing as an effective member of Maoist China? Why am I not actually living up to the ideals of the political ideology? So like, are you calling for, like, was that good? Or is what you're calling for something quite different than that?
What I'm calling for actually does trace back. I'm not sure I would call Lenin and Stalin the heroes of, right?
Yeah.
But I would say more a couple of Bolsheviks who ended up getting shot, you know, because they really did believe in it. And so I think there is actually a thread there of continuity. I do believe that some of the more idealistic Bolsheviks did genuinely believe in everything I've just said, that there should be a genuine self-critique, you know, individual and collective. Of course, as we know, the provocation in your question is that under Lenin and Stalin, this just became essentially coercive mind control and coerced conformity. But then when we get to sort of, you know, the Frankfurt School 1930s, I think there is that lingering sense of what that really should have been, its unperverted form, you know, which again, you know, I think at that time, once again, we get this idea, no, the left, yes, it has to talk about exploitation under capitalism and so forth, but has to also talk about oppression generally, because of course, by that time, they could look back also on the horrors of Stalin and indeed Lenin, right? And again, get back to this genuine sense, and that's, again, gone lost.
Yeah.
It's just gone lost.
So, you know, it's interesting to me because as you in writing this book took up this problem, I have had a very different reaction to the current moment, which was I thought, you know, I should better understand conservatism. And so I'm currently teaching at Princeton a course called The Conservative Tradition in Sociological Thought, because I was like, oh, I should become much more familiar with this intellectual tradition. And as I've done so, you know, the classic account of conservatism versus progressivism is that conservatism is very, very interested in historical legacies and the continuation of those. And progressivism looks forward. So progressivism is basically an ideal where you say, we should be better as a society. And insofar as we should be better as a society, we can articulate policies on the basis of our communities or our state that brings change into the world, which is positive change. And so one of the inherent tensions, as it's classically told, is that conservatives are really deeply interested in the past and the continuity of the past, and progressives are deeply interested in the future and constructing policies that might usher in a future more sort of grounded in justice. What I found so interesting in reading the book is that you tell a very different story, which is basically that progressives are obsessed with the past. So I'm curious if you could like pull that out for me a little bit and explain to me why there's such a tension between the kind of, I would say, accepted dogma of the distinction between progressives as forward-looking and conservatives as looking into the past versus what you're telling us, which is that progressives are just obsessed with the past and can't get out of it and actually refuse to look at their own past.
Yeah, I would flip both of these on their head. Conservatives are obsessed with the future, which is why they so doggedly mythologize and idealize the past. So conservatives are by no means indifferent to the future. Far from it. That's their whole project. Is to reinvent a future based on their reinvented past. But as to progressives, again, broadly construed, I think it would be quite misleading to imagine they're only ever looking at the future as if doing so from a blank slate, right? You can only want to make things better in the future, you know, through a very grounded understanding of what's gone wrong, and that's already doing history. Right? And you don't know what's gone wrong if you only look at the present, right? You need to find the patterns in the present, right? And what's led to where we are. And so I don't want to quite use the word obsessed, um, um, right, I wouldn't want to demonize or overly psychologize it. I think the point here is that while, yes, looking forward to the future, progressives think we can only do this, we can only make progress, we can only build that better society through a very detailed, almost merciless grappling, and not only with the past, but with the past that has to go back several centuries, pretty much to the beginning of modernity, right? I mean, almost any kind of serious critical theory done today ultimately is talking about things going back to the 16th and 17th centuries, and then really as continuous and still ongoing, right? Right?
So this has been maybe a little, so far, a little academic, a little abstract.
Yeah.
I want you to get concrete for me.
Yeah.
What does this look like? So give me an example
Yeah.
of, or like model the behavior that you want to see from the critical theorists. I'd love for you to tell me, like, okay, what would it look like for a critical theorist to do what you're asking for, to critically analyze some aspect of a leftist political philosophy or a leftist political formation, and why does that matter? So, can you give me can you just imagine that, like, your dream scenario? What would a progressive say in analyzing the past, and what's the consequence of that?
Yeah, and I can give two simple answers. It would be something like a Socialist History Month, or even day, even a Socialist History Day, and which would be patterned exactly on, Women's History Month, Queer History Month, Black History Month, or whatever, right? Now, again, how do those work? Of course, those can take many forms, right? They're often multimedia, involving, important films or books, that sort of thing. But discourse analysis is a lot of it. Again, the question is, how have Western liberal democracies used their own values in order to achieve just the opposite? Invoked the value of liberty in order to deprive people of liberty. Invoked the value of equality in order to deprive people of equality. Invoked the discourse of economic opportunity in order to create hierarchy, economic hierarchy, and lack of opportunity, right? This, I think, is central to critical theory, right? This idea of discourse analysis, to show that the discourses of Western liberal democracy, its presentation of its own values has been deeply deceptive, even if not consciously deceptive, even with the best will in the world, right? It has been systemically deployed constantly to produce injustice, right? While being a discourse and a value system of justice. The problem is that the same has been true of regimes to which leftists have committed themselves. Again, not all leftists all the time, but often regimes to which leftists have, at the very least, lent legitimacy for more than a century. And you can do the same kind of analysis, and no one does it. Where are those classes? Where are those, dedicated history months? Where are those training sessions? And where is the consciousness that this really matters in the world we're living in today? How can you understand Ukraine without it? And why is it, right, that the same people who are telling the rest of us to deal with our histories of colonialism and capitalism, and rightly so, they are right to tell us this, right? But why do we hear from them not a word about Ukraine, which involves, 100 years of commitments from the left? Well, almost 100, right? If our friends on the left were practicing, of which I wish I were one, right? We're practicing the same kind of collective self-criticism that they're always teaching the rest of us to do. Ukraine would have been their first and greatest passion, at least over the past 3 years, at least since the February invasion of 2022. Instead, we barely, every now and then you'll see a demonstration. Usually it's done more by Eastern Europeanists. You have, very few people who have any kind of prominence on the left are really part of it. Every now and then, Noam Chomsky writes an article, Judith Butler writes an article. That's pretty much the end of it. right? There's no commitment at all. It's only the rest of us who are supposed to be doing all of the self-critique. That cannot continue.
So let me push you a little on this, and I'll be provincial, which is to say I'll talk about the progressive era, Woodrow Wilson, and Princeton University. So Woodrow Wilson is the champion of the progressive era. The progressive era is frequently identified by the left as one of these major moments of a reinvention of the American state.
Yeah.
That reinvention of the American state along a series of progressive principles leading into the period of time with Roosevelt, also a continuation of progressivism coming out of the Great Depression, which ushers in a series of social programs that restructure America, center justice, center all kinds of things. And yet, leftist historians have been extremely critical of Woodrow Wilson for his resegregation of the government, for the ways in which basically Black Americans were excluded from all of these policies. The left heroes of America in the first half of the 20th century, whether or not we look at Wilson or Roosevelt, have been largely eviscerated by the left for the way in which, in enacting the leftist principles that they did and bringing in the New Deal and bringing in all of these things, they basically engaged in a series of failures because they also did things that were pretty bad. Whether that be segregation, whether that be, the construction of unions that exclude women, that exclude ethnic minorities. So, isn't that an example of the left doing part of what you are asking for the left to do?
No. No. Because the problem is, this is not so much different than them saying, oh, yes, of course, Stalin was terrible. Oh, yes, of course, Mao was terrible. Oh, yes, of course, Pol Pot, right? We get right? Again, you rarely get a denial. What you get is, it's all presented as these were mistakes. These were errors. And that, and so at first that sounds like, yeah, okay, yeah, they're admitting an error, so it's enough for me. The point is that's not the way in which the left teaches about the injustices of Western liberal democracy. They are by no means presented as errors. Just the contrary. Racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, exploitative capitalism are not, it is sacrilege to call them errors of Western liberal democracy. They are inherent with it. They are foundational to it. They are inextricable from it. Who on the left, and with good reason, I teach all this stuff, but who on the left explains leftism this way? So it's on the left, it's just accidents, right? So we get phrases like, well, that wasn't the real socialism. Whether it's FDR or Stalin, that wasn't the real socialism, right? And so, in other words, the rest of us, so when it comes to the critique of Western liberal democracy, it's systemic and ongoing right into the present. We're all still complicit in it. Whereas you say, oh, Stalin, that wasn't the real socialist, and boom, clean line, right? We're done with that. That's in the past. We're not responsible for that anymore. I'll tell you an anecdote, okay? When I did my little rant a few months ago in Chicago, at the university, one of the colleagues there told me about she had been a head of department, and she told me about an interview panel that she had chaired, and one of the candidates comes in, right, and explains that his expertise is in Marx. One of the panelists then puts a question to him, as these interviews are, about Stalin. And his answer was, don't talk to me about Stalin. In other words, not only is there the clean break, but it was a moral fault even to raise the question. Can you imagine? Oh, my specialism is 19th century America. Oh, well, about slavery. Well, don't talk to me about slavery. That would be seen as such arrant incompetence. And yet he took the high road in chastising somebody on the interview panel. Don't talk to me about Stalin. This is bad.
Well, I guess
this is such an absolute lack of the most basic consciousness of what one is telling everybody else to do.
But it strikes me then that the challenge or the problem that you identify on the left
Yeah.
is the account of everything being systemic rather than the failure to do this kind of self-analysis. And so allow me to draw that out a little bit. If the right had critiques that everything was systemic and gave accounts that things were exceptions to the otherwise rule of the systemic, you would have a similar kind of an account. Or thought differently, if the left didn't have an account of everything as systemic and then engaged in some of the things that I've pointed to, critiques of itself, the problem wouldn't be as acute. And so I'm curious if the challenges that the left has a process which it's failing to engage in, which is self-criticism or self-analysis, or if the problem is that the left has constructed a mode of argumentation where all aspects of history are systemic, and that is a failure of explanation rather than a failure of process.
It's a failure if it's not consistent, that's for sure.
Mhm.
We can debate words like systemic and structural. There's always a kind of glass half empty, glass half full element to that sort of thing, you know? I would say, I mean, traditional conservatism, Lord knows what this will look like 10 or 20 years from now. Traditional conservatism has seen as systemic the rather benign elements of culture, right? I mean, that's why they're conservatives. But on the left, it's, seeing injustice as systemic. And again, we can debate this. You know, I mean, I've seen words like systemic injustice used sometimes in the most haphazard, unthinking ways that you wonder, you know, it's almost just like kind of underscoring. It's kind of just like giving a extra oomph. They just want to say unjust, whether it's systemic or not. I wonder sometimes people even know what the word means, right? And so it's just a way of giving a little kick, a little oomph, a little underscore. But if we're going to take it seriously, because some do, right? I mean, someone like Judith Butler is not going to use the word justice. She's going to know exactly what she means, right? Or Slavoj Žižek will know exactly what he means when he says systemic, yeah? Fine. So if we're going to take them seriously, then again, where is the other 50% of that history? In other words, they have to decide. They have to decide either injustice is indeed systemic, but then they have to really explain why that would only happen in liberal democracy when we look at tens of millions of deaths and damaged lives in the kind of regimes to which the left has lent legitimacy without interruption for more than a century, or they do have to abandon this discourse of the systemic and structural injustice. But then I don't even know if there's anything like leftists in the left. That's kind of what critical theory is.
So two last questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. The first, they're both versions of the same question. What are the stakes here? Like, what are the stakes of the argument that you're making? Why does it matter if the left actually does this?
To save the world?
How so? I mean, like, let me push on this. Like, the idea would be that actually people are voting on the basis of ideology. They're making decisions on the basis of ideological formations rather than, to be particularly leftist, a set of material conditions that are deeply influencing them. You propose this idea that somehow the rhetoric and cultural analysis of the left is the thing that's alienating people. And I would be like, well, no, it's actually just that there was a lot of inflation between 2020 and 2024 in the United States. The material conditions changed considerably, and people voted basically on the dynamics of their wallet. And if that changed, it doesn't really matter what the rhetoric of the left here is. So let me be more pointed in that way. What is the stakes for this idea of discourse and rhetoric in terms of our present day politics?
And I would still say extremely high. You're right that by the time we're talking about someone going into the ballot box, it's the bread and butter issues that are usually on their minds, right? But again, this is true across the board. We could put the same question to people, well, what's the point of teaching slavery? People are just voting on bread and butter issues. Would you dare say that to any of your colleagues? No.
Yeah.
No. Okay? Or patriarchy or heteronormativity or the whole long list, right? And so, in other words, either the stakes are everywhere or they're nowhere. But I'm not sure why they would suddenly cut off when it comes to the left doing its own self-critique.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, would I say this to my colleagues? No, but it's pretty common among my colleagues for people to say that the left's obsession with race, gender, sexuality, trans issues has cost it votes.
But you're not going to tell them to stop teaching the course.
That would be a pretty accepted thing.
But you're not going to tell them to stop teaching the course. You're not going to say, why are you
I'm not going to tell them to stop teaching the course out of a basic commitment to academic freedom. Like I would be deeply committed to my colleagues teaching whatever they wanted to teach on that basis. Let me get to the second question.
But I don't think it's so voluntarist.
No,
it's whatever they want.
Yeah.
There are patterns. There are very clear patterns.
The second would be like more practically, okay, for the people who are listening to this conversation right now, what should they do? Like how should we act differently? What are the things that when we all leave this room today, we should be like, okay, Eric gave us this really smart, provocative, interesting argument. Here's some things I should do as I move and in my communities, as I talk to people in my neighborhood, et cetera. Like what are the action steps that you would encourage from the people in this audience right now on the basis of the argument you've made?
And again, it's the same, right? In other words, again, we can put that same question to someone who wants to talk about patriarchy or slavery or heteronormativity, right? Now, then they may say, oh, well, slavery that has ongoing effects in our communities and I can interact there. And heteronormativity, yes, and I can interact at that level. And patriarchy as well. Well, we also live in a world, right, where millions of lives have been damaged. Right? Unless we only want to concentrate on our own backyards. But that's not something I see a lot of in recent politics, or even not so recent politics. I see constantly people saying, no, justice takes place also beyond our own backyards, particularly when we're at the source of it, right? And so, I don't know, I guess the question is, well, how important is what's going on in Ukraine? How important is what might happen to Taiwan? Right? So, sometimes very concretely to people we know. I know Ukrainian refugees, and I know there are a couple here, right? And I know even more important than isolated refugees and isolated lives is what the world is going to be looking like over the next few years and then decades, and what the consequences will be. So it's all just as abstract, or it's all just as real. Whether it's history of socialism, history of racism, history of patriarchy, history of heteronormativity, history of colonialism, history of capitalism, they can all be done at a very abstract level. There's a place for that, and they all have very concrete implications. Otherwise, I don't know why we would be doing them at all.
So maybe to answer my own question, like what I should be doing is perhaps instead of simply in a Carl Schmitt kind of way, thinking about politics as friend or foe, and I don't question my friends, I should think about politics in a different way and think about what are some of the negative consequences of the political and ideological commitments that I have, and how might I grapple with those? Would that be the kind of thing you'd like to see on the part of the left?
At the very least. But also maybe, some practical, maybe, let's see an encampment about Ukraine. Let's just see what happens. That's concrete, just for the hell of it. Maybe it'll actually matter in the world. Otherwise, I don't know why all of their others would.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So please join our conversation. I see a question over here and a question over there.
So I'll just ask that everyone waits for us to bring the mic, and coming right over.
And if you're comfortable, introduce yourself to the room. You don't have to. Just my teacherness in me.
No. I like that too. What's your name?
John.
John.
Yeah, just interested party. Okay, so I could ask about 7,000 questions, but okay. So one, the idea of like structuralism, systemic, racism, systemic, whatever it might be, repression. Just kind of curious, so that, all right, is it possible that for the left to do its own critical self-evaluation, that what you're looking at in capitalism, in what Mannheim's Principia Media, the idea that this is the power structure that you have, that that's where the structuralism comes from. So if you're looking at it from the left, you don't have such power structures. They're sort of intermittent. They're not the principia media. They're like intermittent kind of distractions in like, I'm sorry, in like intermittent interruptions in global capitalism, or, you know, the idea of how the world works, if you will.
Yeah.
So like if you get communism, you get Mao, you get, so these they don't last long enough to have a structural sort of impact, if I'm making any sense. It's sort of like you can't sort of do the same analysis because the power structures are a little bit different. And then one final thing, you had mentioned the two lovers analogy, that like if you bitch at someone, you say like, okay, look, you know, you leave the toothpaste out and you do that.
Right.
And then, or you can say, you do this, but you know what? I don't take the trash out and I don't wash the dish. So, but that doesn't strike me as like a structural kind of thing. That strikes me more as like in criticizing one side, but admitting your own faults at the same time, which doesn't strike me as critical theory doing the left. That almost strikes me more of a pragmatic way to have a conversation about politics. So I'm just wondering if those two are different. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Do you want to gather a few questions?
Yeah. You
Maybe a
yeah.
couple?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
saw
yeah.
some other.
Hi, Eric.
Alberto.
Yeah.
Alberto, yeah.
My question is about that I think it's implicit in your presentation. Since Marx, the left has been shaping the narrative of history. But now this power is on social media. How do you analyze the damage of social media about those themes that you said, LGBT rights, Black movement, because people are in a bubble, a virtual bubble, and these themes maybe are not sensibilized more. How do you analyze it? The power of social media and the left, the left movement does have more the power to shape the narrative of history. Sorry.
Interesting. Thank you.
Want to take these two, and then
take
we'll
these two, yeah.
others can ponder.
Yeah. John, I think it's a really interesting point about how, in a certain sense, you know, something like Stalinism, Stalinist era, or the Maoist era, you know, in the broad sweep of history, there were kind of flashes in the pan. And so, of course, you know, just between you and me, but one of the things an analogy I draw in the book is on the ultra far right in Germany, and only there, a very prominent far right AfD politician has said the same about Hitler and Nazism. Oh, it was only 12 years, right? But the whole point is that, you know, these sorts of historical movements are so devastating, even if their formal duration might seem limited, that they have consequences for generations. You know, there are plenty of people still suffering from things done by Stalin and Mao. The difference is, to our Western civilizations, the difference is that they are largely doing so in a culture where you keep quiet about it, which is another reason we don't notice it. Right? In cultures that have little or no tradition of, you know, publishing the books about it and going on chat shows and doing the circuit and doing film documentaries and everything else. That's a very Western way of dealing with pain, with historical trauma. Let me get to Alberto, then I'll get, yeah, sorry, did you want?
I guess I'm kind of stuck on the structuralism aspect to
Okay.
it. Not that it didn't do damage, and it's not that it's a short period of history.
Okay.
It's just that it, as a power dynamic, that, again, like capitalism or Western civil, its power structure has been embedded for 500-600 years, however you want to date capitalism. But the idea of communism, like, okay, like failed Marxism in the Soviet Union, however you want to describe it, it's not the consequences or the pain. It's its duration, if you will, not a sense of just 12 years, but it never had the chance to have power structures on equal terms.
Yes,
If
and no, I mean,
that makes any sense?
you know, it's a really a fascinating point, and you can be sure I won't sleep tonight. Thank you for that. And one of the things I talk about, you know, maybe a little Foucauldian move in the book, is the ways in which, for example, the Soviet Union used language at a mass way in order to, you know, essentially create outsider classes in order to hold a population in fear, using words like, you know, parasites, fifth columnists, spies, traitors. There was a long vocabulary. Okay, we're going back to really to this first days of Lenin. 100 years later, well, okay, not 100, but many decades later, you know, Fidel Castro, under seemingly different circumstances, is using all the same techniques, right? And these do implant them. And it's one of the things I say, it's still happening in Russia. Soviet Union's gone, they use all the same techniques, right? Chavez has used these, right? And so I do think there are patterns that have implanted themselves, you know, and that are continuing to operate. But it's a fascinating question. Alberto, now what's interesting about social media? Yes, social media has unleashed a certain voice and particularly a power of mobilization on the left, because it's done so across the spectrum, right? And indeed, the more kind of, I don't really like these words, but extreme or radical a group is in whatever ideological direction, the more the internet has managed to make it cohere and helped it to mobilize, whether it's for Trump, for Mamdani, for terrorists, you know, whatever. And so, yeah, so I think I can say absolutely yes, but then the question is what follows from that, which is very interesting that you brought that up, because that's kind of what I spend most of my time doing is on free speech, actually. That's kind of more my specialty, right? But yeah, you know, and you know what it means to regulate this, and you know, with what legitimacy do we regulate simply the expression of ideas? I mean, you know, every free speech conference I go to nowadays, it's just everyone scratching their heads and throwing their arms up, and what the hell are we supposed to do?
We have time probably for one more question. Oh, wait, I'm going to take, sorry.
What's your name?
Mary.
Mary, yeah.
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah.
I really still don't understand what the left is supposed to do.
But the thing is, so what I was trying to say, again, I'm a bit of a consistency freak. If we were to put that same question to someone who thinks we need to learn more about feminism, or about queer people, or about ethnic minorities, would you expect a response from them? Because you'll get the same, huh? You'll get the same response from me. In other words, they're not going to tell you, you know, go out and vote for, or rarely they may, you know, go out and vote for X, or go out and, you know, start knocking on doors or doing leaflets. We're all going to have our own style of activism or engagement in our own ways, right? And that's why what they focus on, if they're teaching you about feminism, if they're teaching you about racism, if they're teaching you about colonialism, capitalism, it's to heighten awareness in the hope that you'll then do something with that. I don't know how one could be more specific, but I don't think that's particularly unspecific, because if that's too vague, then again, are we wasting our time learning about slavery? Are we wasting our time learning about, you know, the history of feminism, the history of queer people, and so forth? Why? I don't understand why it would all of a sudden be a waste of time to be learning about the historical commitments on the left. Why would that suddenly pose problems about what should we do with all this, right? When the concrete effects in the real world are as powerful as those of patriarchy and heteronormativity and slavery and colonialism and capitalism, right? Which is the ravages of autocracy in, you know, Russia, in China, in Cambodia, in Cuba, in Venezuela. So it would be hard for me to see that as terribly vague, and all the other things the left does is terribly concrete. So all I'm saying is, yeah, you know, I can't be more concrete, but I don't see how I'm being less concrete. Because I can't prescribe for every individual what they should go out and do. Does that make some sense? You're still not happy?
I think there's another.
I hope you let me know sometime. Yeah. There's one over here, Cliff.
I saw one over here as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, fine with me.
Can you for a minute longer? Is that okay? All right.
You're okay?
I'm fine. I have
Yeah.
to head home in a moment.
What's your name?
Noreen.
Noreen, yeah.
So that you have answered it for me, because for me, it would be to increase my awareness and be more open to what is happening. To educate myself would allow me then to be more productive in what I would hope to happen in the world.
Okay. And yeah, it's about as much as I can hope for, right? Let's take, you know, something that's been on everybody's minds, obviously, for the past few years is something like Gaza, right? Now, right, if we look at a lot of the activism around Gaza, and particularly on university campuses, I don't know particularly how it was in Princeton. That one did not get the kind of notoriety that we saw with Columbia or Harvard or some of the others, right? Now, a lot of this activism, right, was about understanding this particular Middle East situation as a legacy of ongoing injustices, structural systemic injustices within Western history, namely colonialism and racism. And these became the fixed paradigms: Israel colonialist, Israel racist. I think these are debates that are worth having. For me, it's not clearly yes or clearly no. I think these are very difficult ideas. They're very complex, intricate. In what way might we talk about Israeli society as racist or as colonialist? Again, I don't think there is a simple yes or no, but that's still only 50%. Again, in any of those encampments, and so I'm open to those discussions. I wish they would have taken place instead of just lots of dogma, right? So I'm open to those discussions about, colonial configurations or racist configurations. But in any of those encampments, did anyone talk about the heinous history of leftist commitments and the implications they had for the Middle East? For leftists who had been, again, lending massive legitimacy to a Soviet Union which was dumping anti-Semitism into the Middle East, which was dumping KGB-style governments into the Middle East. How many of those encampments was this discussed by all of those people who are teaching the rest of us that we need to know history? Just to kind of, my little footnote to Noreen's, to Noreen helping me out, right? And so that's about as concrete as I can get. And I think it is, because obviously there have been many people who thought that it was. And so if we think that kind of activism, those encampments, the protests, is something very concrete and immediate and real that that people care about, well, can we have the other 50% of that history, please? Because I'm not asking us to deny the first 50%. Not at all. I want to discuss that. But without the other 50%, it's not a discussion. It's just myth-making.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up there. So, Eric, Shamus, thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a pleasure.
Sorry, I know, well, you stopped laughing.
No, it was good.